Cain is remembered for the first murder in the Bible, but his mark does not appear as an extra curse. That is what makes this story feel stranger than most people remember. Most people carry the same basic version in their heads. Cain gets angry. Cain kills Abel. God confronts Cain. Then everything keeps moving toward harsher punishment, darker consequences, and total collapse. It feels like the kind of story that should become more brutal with every line. And by this point, that expectation makes sense. The crime has already happened. Abel is already dead. The guilt has already been exposed. Nothing is hidden anymore. Cain is no longer just the brother with a bad attitude and an obvious resentment problem. He is now the brother who acted on it. So the reader is standing exactly where the story seems most predictable. Everything appears to point in one direction: worse punishment. That is the setup. And then the text takes a turn that feels deeply uncomfortable. Cain hears the consequences of what he has done, and fear rises immediately. He knows his future has changed. He knows the ground will no longer respond to him the same way. He knows his life has been broken by what he did. And then he says what he is really afraid of: someone will find him and kill him. That is the moment where most people expect the story to go full revenge. It would be the cleanest ending. Cain killed, so now Cain lives under the threat of being killed. Simple symmetry, simple logic, very easy to explain. The kind of thing people expect stories to do, especially ancient stories where nobody is pretending this was just a misunderstood family disagreement. But that is not what happens. When Cain fears being killed, God places a sign on him, and the sign appears tied to protection. That is the part many readers do not slow down long enough to notice. The mark is not introduced as one more curse stacked on top of the first one. It is not presented like some final layer of divine cruelty just to make the punishment feel complete. The scene stays severe, yes. Cain is still guilty. Abel is still dead. The consequences are still real. Nothing in the story becomes soft, and nothing about Cain suddenly turns him into a tragic innocent. But the mark itself points in a different direction. It is there so that no one kills him. That is why this part of the story still unsettles people when they actually stop and look at it. The problem is not that Cain avoids consequence. He does not. The problem is that the text refuses to turn the moment into the obvious version people expect. Judgment is there, but judgment is not the only thing there. And today, that still feels strange. It feels like the moment when someone does the worst possible thing, and the next response comes from a place nobody was expecting. Not approval, not denial, but something that keeps the chaos from spreading even faster. That is what makes the mark of Cain so uncomfortable. It does not look like punishment added on top of punishment. It looks like protection in the place where most people expected only destruction. And that's where the story starts to get truly uncomfortable. Cain's murder does not begin in the field. It begins much earlier, in the way he lets rejection rot inside him. That is what makes the story heavier than it first looks. From the outside, the visible problem still seems small. Two brothers bring offerings. One is received favorably, one is not. At that point, nothing has exploded yet. Nobody is dead. There is no field, no blood, no public disaster. The moment still looks contained, almost manageable, but Cain is already changing on the inside. He does not explode out of nowhere. That is important. The story does not present him like a man who suddenly snaps for no reason at all. First comes frustration, then resentment, then anger that has enough room to sit down, get comfortable, and start decorating the place. By the time violence shows up on the outside, something has already been growing in silence for a while. That is Cain's real danger. He becomes the man who feeds internally what he later releases externally, and the story makes that clear before the murder ever happens. Before there is blood, there is a warning. Before there is death, there is confrontation. God speaks to Cain while the problem is still forming, while the anger is still alive but not yet acted out, while the collapse is still preventable. The focus is not only on what Cain might do next, it is on what is already happening inside him. That detail matters, because it means the issue was never just the offering itself. The offering is the visible trigger, but not the full problem. The deeper issue is what Cain does with rejection once he feels it. He does not face it honestly. He does not master it. He does not cut it off early. He lets it breathe. He lets it stay. He gives envy time to grow teeth. And once that happens, the field is really just where the inside becomes visible. That is why the story still feels modern. It is the kind of situation where the outward problem still looks small, but inside, something much darker is already being fed. From a distance, it seems like a manageable disappointment, a bruised ego, a bad reaction. Nothing dramatic yet, but under the surface, the person is already building the version of the problem that everyone else will only notice later, once it becomes impossible to ignore. That is Cain here. The murder does not begin with a weapon. It begins with a heart that refuses to deal with rejection properly. It begins when frustration is left unattended long enough to harden into envy. And it deepens when that envy is allowed to sit there without resistance. So when the story eventually reaches the field is not the true beginning of the collapse. It is the reveal. The real fall starts earlier, in the quiet part, when Cain still has time to turn back and does not. And when that inner problem finally explodes, the murder is still not the strangest part of the story. The murder looks like the bottom of the pit. But Cain's story becomes even more uncomfortable when he is confronted. By this point, the anger has already turned into action. Abel becomes the target, and the first human death enters the story. That alone would be enough to make this scene feel like total collapse. The line has been crossed. The damage is permanent. The worst thing has happened, and it happened inside the first family, which is not exactly a strong start for humanity. So it would be easy to think the story has already reached its darkest point. But it has not, because after the murder, Cain is confronted by God, and that is where another layer of the collapse becomes visible. He does not break. He does not immediately unravel in grief. He does not come forward with full honesty. He turns aside. He answers with hardness. He speaks as if the truth can still be kept at a distance, as if the reality of what he has done might somehow become lighter if he refuses to face it directly. And that changes the feel of the story. Now the problem is no longer only the murder itself. The problem is also the kind of man that appears after the murder, the man who does not just destroy in anger, but then stands in front of the truth and tries to answer it sideways. The man whose violence is not only visible in the act, but also in the way he handles exposure once the act is done. That is what makes the collapse feel heavier. It is one thing for a person to do something terrible in a moment of rage. It is another thing for that same person to stand in front of the truth and behave as if guilt can still be pushed away. That is the modern shape of the same pattern. The destruction happens in the impulse, but the collapse grows larger when the person still tries to dodge the truth after everything is already out in the open. Humanity had barely begun, and the first twisted answer was already there. That line lands because it shows how quickly the story moves from violence to distortion. Cain is not only guilty, he is now exposed as the kind of man who can speak back to reality with a bent response. The murder reveals one thing. The confrontation reveals even more, and the consequences keep unfolding. Abel's blood cries out from the ground. The earth no longer responds to Cain in the same way. He becomes a wanderer, unstable, displaced, marked by what he has done. Nothing about the story is hidden now. The collapse is fully exposed, the violence, the deflection, the rupture, the judgment. It is all there on the table. So no, the murder is not the end of Cain's collapse. It is the point where the inside becomes visible, and the confrontation shows just how deep the damage already goes. And even then, the part that disturbs the most has still not appeared yet. This is where the story moves away from what almost everyone expects. By now, Cain has already killed Abel. He has already been confronted. The consequences have already begun to unfold. The guilt is exposed, the ground is cursed against him, and his future has been broken open. So at this point, most readers are expecting the cleanest possible ending. Total vengeance. Cain fears being killed, and honestly, that expectation makes perfect sense. He has already started the cycle of violence. He has already brought death into the story. So now the obvious next step would be for that same violence to come rushing back at him. That is the version people instinctively expect. He killed, so now he should simply become the next victim. Simple symmetry. Simple justice. No mystery left. But the text does something else. God places a mark on Cain so that no one kills him, and that is the moment the whole story becomes harder to reduce into a neat moral formula, because the mark does not disturb the reader by looking like extra cruelty. It disturbs the reader by looking like protection given to someone nobody would call worthy of protection. That is why this moment is so strange. If the mark looked like one more curse, it would fit the instinctive version of the story. People would nod, move on, and file it under obvious judgment. But that is not what happens. The mark appears as a limit. It does not erase Cain's guilt. It does not undo Abel's death. It does not soften the consequences already placed on Cain's life. Nothing here turns him innocent, and nothing here makes the story sentimental. The scene still carries judgment. The rupture is still real. Cain still lives under the weight of what he has done, but now something else is standing there too. Protection. And that combination is what makes the moment so unsettling. The real discomfort of the mark is not in raw punishment. It is in the fact that judgment and protection appear together in the same man. That is the part many people do not know what to do with. The story refuses to become pure revenge, even when revenge would feel easier to explain. And that still feels very modern. It feels like the moment when someone deserves the worst possible outcome, and instead of letting the chaos keep multiplying, a limit is placed on what happens next. Not because the person is innocent, not because the damage was small, but because the story is not interested in letting violence simply spread forever in a straight line. That is what the mark reveals. It is not there to make Cain look better. It is there to stop the chaos from immediately reproducing itself through him again. And that is exactly why this scene remains one of the most uncomfortable turns in the whole story. The mark of Cain does not shock because it looks like extra punishment. It shocks because it looks like protection, right where most people expected only destruction. And that is where the text becomes truly disturbing. A shallow reading of this story stops at the crime. And that is exactly why so many people miss the most disturbing part. By the time the mark appears, Cain is not suddenly fine. Nothing resets. Nothing goes back to normal. Abel is still dead. The fracture is still real. Cain still carries consequence, and the guilt does not disappear just because the story moves into a different scene. That part matters, because this is not a soft ending wrapped around a hard event. The damage stays where it is. Cain still lives under judgment. The ground is still against him. His future is still unstable. His name is still tied to the first murder in the biblical story. So the mark does not erase anything important. It does not cancel the weight of what he did. It does not rewrite him as innocent, misunderstood, or secretly blameless all along. The story is not doing any of that. But it is also not treating the mark as if it were only one more curse. That is the detail people tend to flatten, because the easiest version of Cain's story is the most rigid one. Cain killed. God judged him. End of message. Nice, clean, severe, and very easy to summarize in one sentence. But the actual story does something more unsettling than that. It keeps the judgment, and at the same time, it places a limit on how far the violence will keep spreading. That is what makes the mark so hard to reduce. It does not remove justice, it does not remove consequence, but it also does not allow the story to become an endless chain of retaliation. Cain is not turned into an innocent man, but neither is the mark presented as if its only purpose were to increase his misery. The text holds both things in place at once: weight and limit, judgment and protection, guilt and restraint. And that combination is what gives the story its real force. Because now Cain's story is no longer just about a man who killed. It becomes the story of a man who carries rupture, consequence, and the full weight of what he has done, and still receives a sign that keeps violence from simply continuing to spread over him. Not because he deserved praise, not because the crime was small, but because the story refuses to let chaos multiply without restraint. That is the part people do not always expect from this scene. They expect the murder, they expect the judgment, they expect the curse language. But the mark creates a harder question. What does it mean when the same story shows both consequence and protection in the same man? That is why the mark of Cain still unsettles people. It does not shock because it looks like a curse. It shocks because it looks like protection. Which biblical moment should I simplify next? Jonah? David? Samson?